Welcome to Creepy Corner Stories. Some schools never let go of their students, and some students never leave. This school has been abandoned for years, yet every night, the sound of little feet running through the halls sends shivers down the spine of anyone who dares to step inside. The townspeople say the children never left, victims of a tragedy long forgotten. Some claim they see their ghostly figures standing by the windows, staring. Others swear they've heard them laughing, playing, crying. But if you listen closely, you might just hear them calling you too. Are you ready? Let's begin. Story whispers in the halls. The old St. Mary's Elementary School had been abandoned for over 30 years. The walls were cracked, the playground was overgrown, and yet, every night, lights flickered inside. Locals whispered about the missing class of '92, a group of children who vanished without a trace. The school shut down soon after, and no one ever found out what happened to them. But so say they never left. Mike and his friends were thrill seekers. On a dare, they decided to sneak into the school at midnight. Armed with flashlights and phones, they laughed at the town's ghost stories until they stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with an eerie silence. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally down the dust-covered halls. "Come on, guys, it's just an old building," Mike scoffed. But the deeper they went, the more wrong it felt. As they entered a classroom, the chalkboard was covered in writing, but no one had touched it. The words, "Help us." Suddenly the temperature dropped. The air turned icy. The faint sound of children giggling drifted through the hall. Then, a chair scraped across the floor by itself. The door slammed shut. Shadows moved on their own, forming small figures near the desks. The giggles turned into whispers. "They're here." Mike's flashlight flickered. He saw them, pale-faced children in old uniforms, standing at the front of the room. Their eyes were hollow, their faces frozen in eerie, lifeless grins. One stepped forward. "Come play with us," she whispered. Panic set in. The group rushed for the exit, but the hallways kept changing, twisting, stretching, leading them in circles. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closing in. Finally, Mike spotted an open door. He shoved his friends through it, sprinting outside into the cold night. They didn't stop running until they reached the street. The school stood silent behind them. The lights in the windows flickered one last time, and in the darkness, the children watched, still waiting, still playing, forever. Story: The Shadow in the School Basement. The old Willow Creek Elementary had one rule: never go near the basement. Teachers ignored questions about the heavy steel door at the end of the hall, rusted over from years of neglect. Some claimed it led to an unused storage room. Others whispered about the janitor who vanished there in 1975. No one dared to question it, until Ethan, a curious 12-year-old, decided to break the rule. It was late October when Ethan stayed behind after school to grab his forgotten notebook. The hallways were empty, the silence pressing against his ears. As he walked past the basement door, something stopped him in his tracks. It was open. A dim, flickering light pulsed from below, casting long, jagged shadows on the steps. The air smelled damp, old, like something rotten. Then he heard it, a faint scraping sound like nails dragging across concrete. His pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to run, but something moved at the bottom of the stairs. A shadow stretched across the floor, twisting unnaturally, too long, too thin, and then it looked up. Two glowing eyes, yellow, hollow, hungry. The scraping grew louder as the shadow crawled toward him, unnatural limbs twisting, fingers stretching. Ethan let out a strangled scream and bolted up the stairs, his heart slamming against his ribs. He didn't stop running until he reached the front doors, bursting into the cold night air. The next morning, the principal found Ethan curled up in a classroom corner, shaking, his skin ice cold. He never spoke of what he saw. He never returned to school. But the janitor, an old man who had worked there for years, simply nodded when he heard. "You're lucky," he murmured. "Most don't make it back." That same day, the basement door was welded shut. No one ever opened it again. But at night, if you stand close enough, you can still hear the scraping. Story: The Children of Blackwood Academy. The old Blackwood Academy had been abandoned for years, yet on some nights, passers-by swore they could see faint lights glowing through the cracked windows. Some even claimed to hear children laughing inside, though no one had stepped foot in that building for decades. Lena had heard the stories all her life. As a child, her grandmother warned her never to go near the school. "The children there never left," she'd whisper, her eyes dark with something Lena didn't understand. But now, at 17, Lena wasn't afraid of ghost stories. When her friends dared her to spend an hour inside Blackwood Academy, she didn't hesitate. Pushing open the heavy front doors, a wave of cold air rushed past her. The scent of dust and mildew filled her nose as she stepped inside. The hallways were eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the rotting floorboards beneath her feet. Desks and chairs lay scattered, forgotten. Old, faded artwork still clung to the walls, drawn by hands that had long since turned to dust. Then, somewhere in the distance, a soft giggle echoed through the halls. Lena froze. The air around her felt suddenly heavy, like she was being watched. The giggle came again, closer this time. Heart pounding, she turned toward the sound, her flashlight flickering as she did. At the end of the hallway stood a small child, no older than 6. Her dress was old-fashioned, dirty, her skin pale as chalk. The little girl tilted her head. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Lena's breath hitched in her throat. More giggles came from behind her. Slowly, she turned her head and saw them. Dozens of children, standing in the shadows. Their faces were twisted, eyes black and empty. Some were smiling, some were crying. The little girl stepped forward, reaching out a tiny ice-cold hand. "Stay with us," she said. Lena turned and ran. She didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for breath. The school loomed behind her, its windows dark and empty. But just before she turned away, she saw them, the children, standing at the window, watching, smiling. She never spoke of that night, never told anyone what she saw. But sometimes when she passed by Blackwood Academy, she could swear she heard the faint sound of children laughing, and she knew they were still there, waiting. Story: The Forgotten Class. It started as an urban legend, an old story passed down by teachers, janitors, and students who swore something was wrong with Ridgeway Elementary's East Wing. The school had expanded decades ago, yet one particular hallway remained locked, its doors sealed with rusted chains. Some said it was due to asbestos, others believed it led to storage. But the real story, the one whispered in hushed tones, was about the forgotten class. No records of these students existed, no names, no yearbooks. But every so often, someone would hear the echoes of laughter from behind the locked doors, the sound of tiny footsteps running down the halls when no one was there. Derek didn't believe in ghosts, but when his friends dared him to sneak into the East Wing, he was more than ready to prove them wrong. That night, they pried open a window and slipped inside. The air was thick, stale, and the hallway stretched before them, lined with dust-covered lockers. The silence felt unnatural, pressing against their ears. Then the whispers began, soft, childlike, coming from inside the lockers. Derek swallowed hard, his flashlight flickered. His friends were already backing toward the exit, but he took a step forward. A door creaked open at the end of the hallway, a classroom. Inside, the desks were perfectly arranged, untouched by time. A chalkboard covered in lessons from a day that never ended. And sitting in the chairs were children. Their faces were pale, frozen in silent expressions of grief and terror. Their eyes, black, empty voids, snapped toward Derek the moment he stepped inside. A boy in the front row smiled. "You're late." The door slammed shut behind him. Derek's screams never left that room. By morning, the East Wing was chained again. His friends never spoke about what happened. And the school? It continued on, just as it always had. Except now, if you listen closely outside that hallway, you might hear a new voice joining the forgotten class. Story: The Last Bell. The old Rosewood Academy had been abandoned for nearly 20 years, yet the school bell still rang every evening at exactly 6:06 p.m. No one knew why. The building had no electricity, no maintenance, nothing but crumbling walls and shattered windows. Some believed it was the wind. Others thought it was just an old mechanism stuck on a timer. But the few who dared to go inside knew the truth. Danny had always been skeptical of ghost stories. When his older brother bet him $50 to spend an hour inside the academy alone, he laughed and took the challenge. Armed with a flashlight and his phone, he slipped through a broken window just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The inside of the school was worse than he expected. Desks were overturned, books torn apart, papers scattered across the floor. The smell of mold and decay filled the air. As he made his way down the hall, he noticed something strange. The chalkboards were covered in writing. Names. Hundreds of names. Some were old, barely visible under layers of dust. Others were fresh, as if someone had written them that very day. At the bottom of the board there was a message. Class is never dismissed. The clock on the wall ticked forward. 6:05 p.m. Danny's stomach twisted. The air grew thick, charged with something unseen. He turned to leave, but the door he entered through was gone. Nothing but a solid brick wall in its place. The bell rang, a deafening, metallic chime that rattled the walls. And then, the whispering started. At first, it was just a soft murmur, but then the voices grew louder, surrounding him, echoing off the walls. Danny spun around, his flashlight flickering. In the dim glow, figures began to appear. Small, shadowy shapes standing in the corners, sitting at the desks, peering at him from the ceiling. Their faces were blurred, shifting, wrong. One stepped forward, a little girl with tangled hair and hollow eyes. She lifted a trembling hand and pointed at the board. Danny followed her gaze. His breath caught in his throat. His name had appeared at the bottom of the list. The children smiled. The flashlight died. By the time his brother came looking for him, there was no sign Danny had ever been there. But when they checked the chalkboard, there was a new message scrawled beneath the names. Class is never dismissed. Story: The Silent Playground. The old Hollow Creek School had been abandoned for decades, yet its playground remained untouched. The swings still swayed on windless nights. The seesaws creaked, though no one ever played on them. Locals said if you listened closely, you could hear the distant laughter of children, long after the school had closed its doors. No one knew why the school shut down so suddenly. No records, no explanation, just an entire building left to rot. Mark had always been curious about it. On Halloween night, he and his friends dared each other to sneak inside. Armed with only their phone lights, they climbed over the rusted fence and stepped onto the playground. The moment his foot hit the ground, the air grew heavy, thick with something unseen. The merry-go-round spun on its own, slow and deliberate. The sound of faint giggles echoed through the empty yard. Mark turned to his friends, but their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear. Then the bell rang, a sharp, piercing chime that rattled through the night. But the school had been abandoned for over 50 years. Who was ringing it? The laughter grew louder. From the darkness of the school building, figures began to appear, small, childlike, but wrong. Their limbs twitched unnaturally, their heads tilting at impossible angles. Their eyes were black, empty pits. One little boy stepped forward, dragging a broken teddy bear. "You're late for recess," he whispered. Mark felt a cold hand wrap around his wrist. He screamed. The next morning, the town awoke to find the playground empty once again, except for one new detail. A single swing still moved back and forth, as if someone was sitting there. And in the dirt beneath it, there were fresh footprints, too small to belong to Mark. Story: The Class That Never Left. The old Westfield Elementary had been empty for years, yet at night, the glow of classroom lights could still be seen through the cracked windows. People swore they heard the faint sound of chalk scratching against the board, the murmur of voices repeating lessons from a time long forgotten. No one dared to go inside. That changed when Ben, a local urban explorer, decided to film the school for his YouTube channel. He wanted proof that the stories were just myths. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, he slipped through the broken front door and stepped into the dust-covered hallway. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something rotting. The walls were lined with old student artwork, their colors faded, their subjects strangely lifeless. Desks were still arranged neatly in rows, as if the students had simply stood up and left. Then, from down the hall, a door creaked open. A single classroom light flickered on. Ben hesitated. The air felt wrong, but curiosity pushed him forward. Peering inside, he saw rows of small desks, all facing the blackboard where an unseen hand was writing. The chalk moved on its own, etching out two words over and over. Class begins. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The temperature plummeted, and then the whispers began. He spun around, his flashlight flickering. In the dim glow, they appeared, rows of students, sitting motionless at their desks. Their heads turned in unison, hollow eyes staring straight at him. Their faces were pale, stretched, unnatural. One by one, they started to smile. The door behind him slammed shut. The whispers grew louder, blending into a deafening chant. Ben clawed at the door, his heart hammering, but it wouldn't budge. Then a voice, soft, cold, right beside his ear. "Take your seat." The next morning, Ben's camera was found just outside the school. The footage showed the classroom door swinging open on its own. It captured his terrified breathing, the static rising, the whispering voices. But there was no sign of Ben. And if you walk past Westfield Elementary at night, you might hear it, the sound of chalk scraping against the board, and a new voice repeating the lesson. We hope you enjoyed this chilling tale from the haunted halls of Harrow Hill Academy. If you've got the courage to face more ghostly encounters, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss out on any of our spine-tingling stories. And remember, if you ever